And speaking of animation books, here's my interview with Reid Mitenbuler about his book, Wild Minds. Welcome to Animateducated. I want to let you know that I got your book. My daughter bought it for me for Christmas. And this is your book, Wild Minds. The artists and rivalries that inspired a golden age of animation. It's really a fun history and kind of like a fly on the wall kind of perspective of different people in the industry that started the industry. And how long did it take you to write this book?
I was working on it in fits and starts for a while, doing a lot of research, just piecing it together. You get this big pile of research, and then there's all the things you unfortunately have to sacrifice. There's all kinds of great stories, and you're like, well, that doesn't necessarily fit well, or I just have to keep the space at a certain level. Starting around 2016 or so, and then it was going to come out a little bit earlier, but we'd pushed it back. I was a little worried about, politics and the news cycle being driven by all that stuff. So I was like, yeah, I don't know. And my publisher, we were figuring it out. But it's nice that it came out when it did, though, because I think it's a nice escape for people who just want to go into this world and enjoy it for a little while and escape from all of that other stuff going on.
You start off with Winsor McKay, and you introduce him, and and a lot of the stuff I already knew about him, but you go and then you kind of weave away from him into like other people of the day, Emil Cole, and then like you introduce Bray and like these other guys. And it seemed like everybody back then would like invent something and then make a patent. patent it.
Like a lot of industry. I did that to kind of illustrate that it was an industry in a lot of ways. The idea was percolating actually for a very long time, since probably the mid-aughts, around 2005, 2006, where I had read, you'd mentioned Charles Solomon's book, and there's so many other books, like really good, and I, was reading through all of those. I can remember, and this was before Ray Pointer's book about the Fleischers came out, thinking, oh, it could be a good biography of the Fleischers. Biographies, though, in publishing don't always sell well unless people know who the people are specifically. It's like, oh, the Wright brothers, I knew who they are, but I don't know much about them.
Right.
And so I was like, it's probably more interesting just from a story perspective, just to make it readable. Like, what's a way to make this story digestible for a more general audience? And it's like, well, instead of doing a deep dive in any one particular part, you want to have, a little bit about everybody, and then show how they, show their relationships, how they're competing with each other, the different visions of their studios, that kind of thing. So I wrote it really in a way that you might adapt a screenplay. You're gonna have to leave a lot on the cutting room floor, but you're like, there's the essence of the story that you're really trying to capture. And it's, I was pretty careful with my bibliography to kind of point everyone to like all these other great sources. One of the fun things for me is I realized starting in the 1960s, 1970s, animation, it was, people were kind of looking away from it. It wasn't really popular. It was kind of languishing. It was in the doldrums. It was at a bad point. And you had a lot of scholars, historians who realized the same way that a lot of historians realized about jazz, like this is a true American art form, but it's not being celebrated that way. And you see in academia, they start talking about jazz at that same time, maybe 50s, 60s. Like, this is actually pretty special stuff. This is very unique. There's a certain group of people like, Michael Barrier would be a good example, going around interviewing people, recording these interviews, because a lot of them were already getting old by that point. And there's all these old interviews. And I remember listening to some of them in archives and reading through transcripts of a lot of them. I remember just looking at the story and it's like, it's such a great story here, but how can we present it in that, because you said, that fly on the wall kind of way. So a book like mine, it's not possible without a whole lot of other research by a lot of other people. It's just presenting and arranging that pile of research in a different way.
I really enjoyed it because it wasn't like one of those books where you think of history as like, You know, 1875, this happened. He found this, then he invented that,
Yeah,
then he
names and
died.
dates, the names and date style, or like a police report where it's like,
Yeah, right,
this,
right.
then, this, then, and then, yeah. And it's like, I try to avoid that.
Yeah, you get
Um,
inside some of the characters' heads.
I guess my goal was, it's like the cartoons themselves, like all the creators
Yeah,
of the cartoons realize it's about character.
yeah,
It's about these characters and how do you relate to a character. And
yeah.
so while writing a history that was thorough, also wanting to create it around characters so that people maybe see themselves reflected a little bit, or not, but they understand a human impulse or drive. So I was always kind of trying to fashion the story that way. So you see, like, for instance, Walt Disney, the story about him,
Mhm.
where he's on a train and another guy's just chatting with him, and he says, what, finds out he's in the movie business. What part of the movie business? And Walt says, cartoons. And the guy's nose just kind of crinkles, like he's kind of looking at, and then that's the motivation Walt has for, I really need to take this art form and I need to raise it up a level, to have people respect it the same way they respect live action. It's when you see it that way, it just kind of comes alive a little bit.
Yeah.
So that was my goal.
The other thing is, like, I mean, just starting the book with McKay, the funniest thing, thought it was hilarious, where he's, like you said, he's trying to make this an art form, and really bring it up to something good. And he inspired a bunch of animators to work on it. And they wanted to, like, thank him, for helping them, get careers in animation. And so they held a little party for him. Can you talk about that?
Well, this dinner, celebrating Winsor McKay and his contributions, and then there was this kind of the equivalent of like a chain letter where they supposedly, as in the lore as it happens, they played Ever Ready Hard On and Buried Treasure, which is this absolutely filthy cartoon. I mean, it's
Yeah.
full of all kinds of nudity and sexuality and all kinds of. In the story, as the story had it, they couldn't even get it really developed in the United States. You had to take that film down to Cuba to even get it developed. And a lot of this is legend, but it's something that people talked about. It was certainly aware of it, and other people telling people, so secondhand accounts. I think it's such a cool story that way. Like if you're doing the movie version
Oh, yeah.
of all this, you would certainly have that scene in it.
Yeah.
And I want to use it because it points to a certain mentality. It points to the respect that these people had for Winsor McKay, but then the fact that they honored him in this way by showing him this absolutely bawdy, kind of filthy cartoon, whereas he had spent a lot of his time championing something that was a little bit, higher than that. He was, I've got a quote in the book. He's quoted as saying, someday, I'm paraphrasing, but people will be in museums, they won't really be looking at paintings anymore. They'll be looking at this will be art on that level. It'll almost replace that kind of art. And that's kind of what he saw it as. And you can see it in his, he did a few handful of films, but you see it in those, like he had that ambition. And so here they go to honor him. And then that's how they choose to honor him, is with this thing that kind of runs a little contrary to what he was standing for. And
Oh, yeah.
according to the story, he was a little disappointed. And well, it's a totally fun story.
I could just see that, the portrait you painted in your book where, he's like, Winsor McKay's like this kind of, hey, thank you, thank you. And then they're like, yeah, Winsor, we got something for you. Hit it, and they just start showing all these graphic, cartoon characters going at it, and so to speak. And you can just see him just like going, oh crap,
Yeah.
what are you guys doing,
Right.
So it's interesting because you even go through just briefly mention a few things people I never even heard of. In chapter 6, you introduce William Mariner, who commits suicide, lighting his house on fire.
And refusing to leave. Yeah.
Yeah, and he has this comic strip, which is, definitely today would be very racist. And then everybody was wondering, well, who's going to take over the comic strip? So that's when this guy Patrick Sullivan steps in, and he decides he's going to take the comic strip.
Here you've got this comic strip that's pretty bad, Mariner's comic strip, And I wanted to use that story just to illustrate how mercurial and how random and just how of the moment and random a lot of this stuff was, especially in those early days, not curated particularly closely. It wasn't like big mega corporations behind it. It was just kind of, that was a comic strip in the newspapers, and Sullivan inherited it. And he, there was a lot of weird rights issues behind it, some theft, not wanting to pay royalties to, the heirs of Mariner, like that kind of thing. And it just kind of gets to the sensibility, especially that drove Sullivan, that he was a shady character. He would deal in shady things and came to find his fortune in these ways that were just kind of a lot of happenstance was involved, and he was just kind of a shyster. I thought that was just such a great way to illustrate that. So that's why I chose to frame the story in that way and use those particular elements.
Mm.
Maybe a little tangential to animation sometimes, but it really gets at a certain spirit that I think was involved in that world. It was heavily infused in this whole universe.
He hired Otto Mesmer, and Mesmer's kind of like the opposite of him, very kind of
Yeah.
shy guy that, and he's the one that actually came up with Felix the Cat, but then, his boss was this Patrick Sullivan. So it's like, no, it's Patrick Sullivan's Felix the Cat.
If I remember correctly, in The Simpsons, Itchy and Scratchy, they kind of allude to that. Like characters being created by one, the other people reaping their riches.
Right.
Those characters, that kind of thing. It paints a picture of an industry and really of an America that's just very different than today.
Just to show how bad this guy was, I guess at the end of his life, it's like his wife is mad and she jumps out we think she jumps out.
Who knows? Yeah, there's a lot of speculation around that. Like,
either
was she pushed? Did she commit suicide? There was always this lingering question over it. Syphilis, exactly who did she get? Probably her husband. That was a really sad story. Like, that's not a fun story to write.
No.
But, create, as we were talking about before, just creating characters around these other characters that are iconic. That was the other thing I thought would be a cool way to approach old animation.
Mm-hmm.
All these everyone can pull Popeye out of a lineup, or Betty Boop, or, well, of course, Mickey Mouse, but like all these old iconic characters, Felix the Cat, everyone knows who they are. Like, they're aware of them. Usually, I think, through merchandising by this point. But I can remember asking, myself, I was writing a book and talking to other people, animation historians, so forth. I was like, what percentage of the population has actually seen one of these old cartoons, has gone back and looked at a field cartoon from the 1920s? And I remember having a discussion with Jerry Beck about this, and he's like, I'm not sure many do. Like, it's definitely passing out of living memory. Like, they're aware of who these icons are, but they don't really know who they were.
Right.
And so I was like, what I really wanted to do is show the characters behind the characters, because a lot of times the people who created those iconic characters are just as interesting as the characters they created themselves. But I think one of the things I really wanted to do with this book is stay away from analyzing the cartoons themselves, and stay away from, there was a period, especially in the 70s, when you're reading literature from the 70s, when it was really hard sometimes to find copies of some of these works. You'd see a lot of people writing descriptions, like almost like, plot summaries, but also and then. And that's one of the reasons I put that note in the book, where I was like, just go watch it yourself. Right. Like, when people are writing about art and analyzing it, it's kind of like they're draining the blood from a slaughtered animal a little bit, right? It takes the life out of it, and you're kind of like, just go experience art itself.
Right.
You don't need yet another person analyzing it, dropping their opinions, judging it. Instead, I'll just give you a whole other story, but the story about the people creating them. And I think that when you see where their backgrounds were, who they were rivals with, what they were trying to do with their art, it can present those characters in a new way that you kind of learn something different about them that way. And so that was one of my intents, is instead of focusing on Felix the cat, for instance, and really analyze, I've got a little bit of analysis, but I always tried to make that analysis from the time. Like, who are the people who are experiencing this real time? Not us today, where the context is very different and we're not living in that moment with these characters when they're created, when they're speaking to a certain zeitgeist. So I put an analysis of them when it was appropriate from their own era, but then it was, let's just tell you the story of the people around them, around the characters who created them, because I think that'll illustrate certain things about them better than me just analyzing, which no one wants to read.
Yeah. So what was your favorite, like, part of the book, like, what was a story that you discovered, or,
I loved the middle and later sections of my book. It's funny because with a lot of books, they will start strong, and then sometimes near the end, you're sort of losing steam. And I almost feel like I wanted to create a story that always built its own momentum. But I personally like some of the stories in the middle and the end. I love when books bring in outside context. So I've got a lot in here about the politics of the time, like the House Un-American Activities Committee stuff, which affected a lot of animators, the labor union stuff, the Hays Code, stuff that's a little bit tangential to being directly about animation. But I think by adding that, bringing in that context, you can kind of see how the jewel is set a little bit. And when I had a few other people read it, it's funny because, I wanted to make sure this book was something that general audiences who were first coming to animation, just to get that first brush of the story, would appreciate. It was interesting because a lot of them would tell me, some of my favorite parts are those parts. And then you talk to people who are a little more into animation already, enthusiasts, and those tended to be the parts that they didn't like as much. They did not like them, but it was always interesting to see the different perceptions from different readers. Like, some people are, really lean into some parts, and other people. So I like those contextual stories. Those are some of my favorites. I really like the story of Fantasia. I just love that whole setting of Walt Disney and Leopold Stokowski, both collaborators, at times, I guess, rivals, although that rivalry wasn't, certainly like some of the other rivalries in the book, more of a collaboration. But just seeing how this one iconic movie came together. And that's one of those chapters too, where you've got to leave so much on the cutting room floor, but, to keep it moving fast. But I really enjoyed writing it. It's one of the longer chapters, when I say cutting things, but I was like, this has to stay in, this has to stay in. So that's one of my personal favorite parts. I also really enjoyed the part near the end, just talking about TV changing the landscape of animation. You've got the first 50 years where they're playing in movie theaters, kind of as an hors d'oeuvre before the main feature. But revenues in that setting are generated by people coming into a dark theater and paying a ticket. Now they're on TV, where you've got children watching, and then advertisers are providing that revenue. Advertisers want to have a say in the process. It's a very different thing, and it changed the tone of cartoons almost overnight. It's just a sea change immediately. And so I love writing about those economic, political, and technological factors that changed the face of animation in the 50s and 60s, just like a weather pattern, just different.
This is a great time to read books, especially when we're stuck here inside, and especially right today when it's a nice rainy day. But yeah, it's really a fun book. And well, I want to thank you for coming on Animateducated and telling us all about your book here. I just want to plug this one more time. Definitely a great book to get about history of animation, and it's fun to read. It's very interesting, educational, and it's not a lot of just, like you said, this happened and this happened at this time, and then he invented that, and so yeah, great job on that. Well, thanks a lot, Reid. I'll talk to you later.
Bye.
All right, bye. To learn more about Reid Mitenbuler, please contact him at reidmitenbuler.com. I really want to thank all the subscribers that are starting to pour in now. And if you're the 500th subscriber, and if we've already surpassed that number and we're going up to 1,000 now, I will have a prize for you too. So yeah, so this is the goal this year for 2021. I would love to have this channel turn into at least 1,000 subscribers. Yeah, I think it's worth it. I think I'm getting some good interviews here. I think I've got some quality content. And if not, I'll go find some, maybe I'll make some unqualified content. I know I could probably make a good cat farting video, which would probably just send this channel, into the stratosphere. So that's a great idea. Maybe I'll do that right now. Okay, well, maybe that's all I had to do. Anyway, thanks for watching Animated Educated. Again, please subscribe by pushing that little button, or you can take a look at this video or that video up there. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time on Animated Educated.